After betraying their trust, I slammed the door against my mother and father and they screamed, "Then your offspring mean nothing to us, imbecile." Then I stated that I would cease covering their housing payments and their complexions turned ashen. My identity is James and I reside in San Antonio, Texas. Before I delve deeper, I simply wish to express gratitude to all who are dedicating moments to absorb this. I never anticipated being the individual to publish an account such as this. Yet following all that's occurred, I must release it. If you've ever managed relationships with self-absorbed guardians, you'll likely comprehend the variety of madness I'm preparing to outline. I devoted the majority of my existence attempting to become the ideal offspring, the dependable one, the individual who guaranteed my progenitors were comfortable even when they merited no such consideration. They weren't violent in ways that create physical marks, but they were the sort who would exhaust you mentally, make you feel obligated simply for breathing. When I accomplished anything, they'd discover methods to claim responsibility. When I stumbled, everything was my error. Upon my boy's arrival, I imagined perhaps circumstances might shift. He adored his elder relatives, and temporarily, it appeared they genuinely cared for him too. So, when he turned 8, I permitted him to reside with them briefly because he desired proximity to them. I believed I was performing a beneficial act, something that might fortify our familial connections. But the reality is, my ancestors only value individuals when they can exploit them. What I didn't realize was that while I was depriving myself for them, they were circulating rumors that I had deserted them, that they were suffering, that I was scarcely assisting them, compelling them to depend on kindness from kin. Simultaneously, I was the individual settling their lease, covering their expenses, and ensuring they possessed all necessities. They never uttered a syllable to me regarding any of this. They behaved ordinarily, as if we maintained positive relations. I uncovered the truth unintentionally. I dwell 320 kilometers from most relatives, so our interactions are infrequent. But during my sibling's birthday celebration, I encountered my elder sister, whom I seldom see. We were conversing when the topic of our originators emerged. She noted how challenging circumstances had become for her. She explained that she and another family member had been dispatching them funds monthly since their residence was destroyed by flames. Initially, I chuckled, assuming she jested. Their home hadn't been damaged. I'd visited mere weeks prior, but her expression confirmed her sincerity. That's when we both began connecting fragments. It emerged that my forebears had been deceiving all parties. They assured me they were comfortable, while privately telling others they were destitute. They portrayed me as the egotistical offspring who was indifferent while accepting currency from my sister and other kin. They never acknowledged this to me, never expressed appreciation for my efforts. They simply took whatever they could while turning people against me simultaneously. That evening, tensions detonated. Shouting erupted, allegations volleyed wildly. My sister was livid, not solely at them, but at herself for trusting them. I felt nauseated. All instances when I assumed my family had grown distant, I attributed it to life's demands. But no, my ancestors had tainted everything. They depicted me as the antagonist to sustain their charade. I contacted my boy, instructed him to gather belongings, and we departed that night. 4 sunrises later, my begetters materialized at my dwelling, behaving as if nothing transpired. They desired conversation. When I observed their expressions, something within me fractured. I simply gazed momentarily, then softly closed the barrier against them. That's when the intimidation commenced. They proclaimed if I didn't unseal the entrance, they would cease supervising my boy. As though that concerned me, as though I required them. That's when I re-emerged, and the genuine conflict ignited. We howled at each other along the approachway for over 60 minutes. It seemed every bitterness, every concealed fact, every suppressed grievance cascaded forth simultaneously. They labeled me unappreciative, egocentric, a dreadful offspring. I returned every falsehood they'd uttered directly at them. The longer it persisted, the more frantic they grew. Ultimately, I terminated it. I declared I would discontinue their rental payments. When those syllables escaped my lips, the pigment vanished from their faces. They'd constructed their entire deception, presuming I would perpetually rescue them, that regardless of their actions, I'd never completely sever ties. But now they stood on my pavement, comprehending for the inaugural instance that I was no longer their safeguard. And the most satisfying aspect? That was merely the commencement. The instant I voiced my refusal to continue their rent, everything transformed. My progenitors stood immobilized. For the first occasion in my lifespan, they were mute. No feigned worry, no scheming emotional blackmail, simply sheer terror. And that quiet? It was the most gratifying sensation I'd ever experienced. Then, as predicted, the collapse initiated. First emerged incredulity. They behaved as if they'd misheard, as if perhaps I was merely distressed and uttering insincere threats. Then arrived negotiation. They abruptly comprehended my fury and wished to reconcile. But the opportunity had passed. When I remained resolute, the fury activated. My male parent began shrieking regarding my ingratitude, how he'd surrendered everything for my upbringing. My female parent, eternally the more strategic, performed the martyr. She grasped her torso and pretended I was literally ending her existence through strain. I merely stood observing her disintegrate. Then came the vicious attacks. They started asserting I was destroying my boy's future, that I was denying him his elders, that I was establishing a horrendous precedent. It was comical, truly. After all they'd perpetrated, they still believed they occupied moral superiority. I allowed them to vent temporarily, but then I confronted them with the complete reality. I informed them I knew all, that I knew about the fabrications they told my sister and other kin, that I knew about the fictitious residential fire, the tragic tales, the funds they'd been accumulating covertly, and that's when authentic dread manifested. They began refuting everything naturally, but the dilemma with deceivers is that when exposed, they flounder and commence conflicting with themselves. Within moments, they were stumbling over their own narratives, modifying their account repeatedly. One moment, they never accepted currency from my sister. The subsequent moment, they only borrowed minimally because they were impoverished. A minute later, my female progenitor faltered and confessed they required others to appreciate their burdens. They were completely revealed, and they knew it. I told them I was finished. No more housing payments, no more costs, no more assistance whatsoever. I told them they were isolated. My mother's features distorted, as if she'd ingested shattered glass. My father was mute, observing me as if I were unfamiliar. For once, I commanded the situation. Then I rotated and entered. I secured the barrier. I fastened it. And I remained listening as they pounded, shouted, menaced, and ultimately lingered outside silently for an extended duration before finally departing. That night, I occupied my sofa and contemplated my communication device. I understood this wasn't concluded. Individuals like this don't simply acknowledge repercussions. They return. They scheme. They counterattack. I simply didn't anticipate their retaliation so rapidly. I awakened the subsequent dawn to over 12 missed communications and messages from relatives. Some were from my sister inquiring about my welfare. Others were from kin I rarely contacted, insisting to understand why I was forsaking my ancestors during their crisis. And immediately, I knew precisely what had occurred. My begetters had immediately sprinted to everyone with a fresh tragic narrative. I inhaled profoundly and accessed the initial recorded message. It was my maternal aunt, irate, stating she couldn't fathom I'd abandoned my forebears after their lifelong support. Another was from my paternal uncle, discussing familial obligations and his profound disillusionment. But the most severe originated from my female ancestor herself. She didn't yell, she didn't plead. Instead, she delivered an expert guilt assault. She stated she and my male parent were devastated, that they never envisioned I'd discard her like refuse. She concluded with an ominous phrase, "I trust you can exist with yourself following this, James." It was textbook exploitation. They weren't remorseful for deceiving, for manipulating me, for alienating my kin. They were solely regretful I'd ceased participating. I contacted my sister. Upon answering, she exhaled audibly. "I suppose you received the communications?" I recounted everything, how they'd appeared at my residence, how I'd excluded them, how I'd ultimately refused their rental payments. She wasn't astonished, but she was incensed. "You phrase it as if you expelled them onto pathways," she remarked, "as if they're destitute, and you're indifferent." It was absurd. My ancestors weren't impoverished. They possessed finances, just insufficient for their desires. And they certainly weren't without shelter. They retained the identical dwelling, the identical existence, just lacking my economic reinforcement to supplement their reserves. My sister and I dedicated the subsequent hour deciphering their network of falsehoods. It materialized they'd provided each relative a distinct variation. To some, I'd severed ties unexpectedly. To others, I was retaliating for imaginary grievances. They even informed one relation I was experiencing psychological collapse, and that they feared for my boy's security. That segment wounded deeply. They were prepared to weaponize my own child against me. I inquired what she believed I should undertake. She sighed. "I'm uncertain, James, but I understand this. If you don't resolve this immediately, they'll ensure the entire clan opposes you." She was correct. My begetters wouldn't desist. And unless I acted promptly, they'd annihilate every remaining connection. So I determined. I would reveal them conclusively. I believed I'd managed everything. I'd conversed with my sister, clarified matters with several relatives, and commenced feeling in authority. But then, as I prepared to terminate the communication, my sister's demeanor altered. She was viewing something off-screen. "James, I believe you should inspect your exterior." That statement transmitted horror through me. I rose, approached the pane, and upon glancing outside, my core plummeted. My ancestors were occupying my front greensward, not merely standing, not knocking, but seated in outdoor seating, as if establishing encampment. Their vehicle was stationed in my driveway. My female parent was utilizing her device, and my male parent sat arms folded, scrutinizing my residence as if preparing for extended occupation. I simply stood, utterly stunned. This surpassed all expectations. I assumed they'd attempt emotional coercion via calls, perhaps dispatch another relative to persuade me. But this was communal disgrace. They desired my adjacent observers to witness. They sought to create spectacle, to portray me as the unfeeling offspring who deserted his pitiful, distressed forebears. I concluded my sister's call and proceeded outdoors. When my female parent noticed me, she lowered her device as if anticipating my surrender. "We're not departing until you converse," she stated, tranquil as if not occupying seating on my property. I wouldn't succumb to their snare. If I commenced shouting, I'd appear deranged. If I disregarded them, they'd simply remain indefinitely, extracting every possible moment. I needed to conclude this unpredictably. So I turned, extracted my device, and photographed them. They both petrified. My father straightened, my mother's cheek spasmed. I perceived their bewilderment, their flickering dread. They hadn't anticipated this. Without speaking, I re-entered, sat, and commenced typing. I shared the image with a concise caption. For those questioning my severance, this demonstrates their conduct when denied. Within minutes, my device erupted. My sister returned my call, laughing incredulously. Companions messaged, questioning my sincerity. Even previously supportive relatives were dumbfounded. And then, optimally, my ancestors witnessed it. I observed through the window as my mother checked her device and gasped. My father seized his and reddened. They whispered urgently, attempting to manipulate the situation, but they were powerless. They'd portrayed victims eternally, lied perpetually, distorted every account to appear blameless. But now, for the inaugural instance, everyone perceived their reality. I anticipated door pounding, screaming. Instead, they rose, assembled their seating hastily, and nearly sprinted to their transport. My father accelerated so rapidly, he almost collided with my postbox, and suddenly, they vanished. But the harm was complete. My publication had disseminated, and now there was no retreat. I assumed conclusion. I assumed my ancestors had ultimately recognized their manipulation had failed. When they departed hastily, I presumed their humiliation sufficient to deter them. I was mistaken. The subsequent morning, I awakened to another influx of messages and missed calls. But this occasion, it wasn't solely kin. It was individuals I hadn't interacted with in ages. Former schoolmates, childhood neighbors, even a prior colleague. My spirit sank before reviewing. The initial message stated, "Friend, your maternal figure is unraveling online." I immediately checked, and undoubtedly, there it existed. An extensive, raging post from my mother, identifying me directly, depicting me as a heartless, unappreciative offspring who'd publicly shamed his progenitors after their lifelong devotion. She labeled me emotionally unbalanced, alleged long-standing rage difficulties, and worst, she strongly suggested my boy was unsafe in my custody. That portion made my extremities tremble. This surpassed manipulation. This was assault. She'd clearly composed hastily. It was an incoherent combination of partial truths and absolute lies. But the impact was done. The responses were chaotic. Some defended me, recognizing her exploitation. Others sympathized, lamenting offspring abandoning elders. Then I saw it. My father's remark. Brief. "We simply desire to see our descendant." That's when I comprehended the reality. This wasn't about finances anymore. This was about domination. They couldn't reach me, so they targeted my boy. I recognized immediate action was essential. I captured my mother's post, alongside earlier communications. Then I composed a concise counter. For those questioning reality, here's truth. My ancestors have deceived and manipulated perpetually. They've accepted funds through deception, turned kin against each other, and now that I've severed ties, they're attempting public defamation. I lack rage issues. I lack instability history. Most critically, my boy is completely secure and content. If you elect to trust them, that's your decision. But I'm finished with their games. I shared it and disconnected. I wouldn't refresh endlessly awaiting reactions. I'd done what was necessary, but I hadn't anticipated virality. By afternoon, strangers were sharing. Some shared their own narcissistic parent stories. Others directly challenged my mother's lies. Pressure mounted, and by dusk, she erased everything. But the harm was to them. Previous supporters now doubted. Relatives who'd sided with them apologized. Even my uncle, who'd financed their burnt home, texted. I never realized their severity. For the first instance, their deception network was crumbling. And just as I believed I'd triumphed, an unknown number called. I answered, anticipating kin. Instead, a cold, formal voice spoke. Hello, this is Child Protective Services. We've received neglect allegations and must inspect your residence. I froze. They'd done it. My ancestors had actually contacted CPS. I sat, clutching my device until my knuckles whitened. CPS. My own flesh and blood had reported me. I recognized their manipulation. I recognized their desperation. But this? This was pure malice. I inhaled deeply. I feared nothing. My boy was cherished, nurtured, and joyful. There was no case against me. But that was irrelevant. What mattered was their willingness to exploit systems. Systems designed to protect children, simply to punish my defiance. That was final. They'd officially initiated warfare. I contacted my sister first. She answered immediately, tense. What now? When I explained, she erupted. She cursed, labeling them every possible insult. I'd never witnessed her so enraged, and it comforted me to know I wasn't alone. Then she voiced something chilling. What's terrifying? What if they'd planted evidence? Fabricated neglect? I hadn't considered that. But she was right. If they'd falsified reports, what else might they attempt? I disconnected and immediately called my ancestors. They answered instantly, as if awaiting my collapse. My mother's tone was artificially sweet. James, we've been so concerned. I interrupted. I know you contacted CPS. Silence. Then my father spoke cautiously. We were simply worried about our descendant. We had no alternative. No alternative. Something within me shattered. I unleashed everything. I swore if they ever repeated this, I'd legally destroy them. A restraining order so absolute, they couldn't even search my name without violating it. I'd expose them to every relative, every shared acquaintance, every individual they'd ever deceived. I heard my mother's breathing accelerate. My father, typically the shouter, was mute. That's when I recognized their genuine fear. Then I delivered the ultimate blow. You will never see my boy again. My mother whimpered. My father attempted damage control, claiming I overreacted, that family disputes escalate. I wasn't finished. I declared their lies, manipulation, and guilt trips concluded. They'd spent lifetimes controlling others, distorting truths, playing victims. But now, for the first instance, they were powerless against me. Then I disconnected. And suddenly, they were impotent. The CPS inspection occurred 2 days later. A woman arrived, courteous but efficient. She examined, spoke with my boy, and within 20 minutes recognized reality. Departing, she gave me an unforgettable glance. It's always relatives, isn't it? She remarked, shaking her head. I didn't require explanations. She'd witnessed this before. Then came the aftermath. My ancestors attempted reconciliation. Feeble messages from my mother claiming she missed us. A voicemail from my father feigning paternal concern. I ignored everything. And that's when they surrendered. Abruptly, they ceased attempts. No further calls, no efforts to reconnect. They'd failed. And I? For the first instance in existence, I experienced liberation. No guilt, no duty, no more cautious steps, just tranquility. I triumphed. Update. For months, silence. Excessive silence. My ancestors vanished from my life as if non-existent. No calls, no messages, no unexpected visits. The peace I'd always craved. Then, unpredictably, my father appeared at my workplace. It occurred on an ordinary Thursday. I was working when a colleague knocked, appearing uncomfortable. James, there's someone requesting you at reception. Claims he's your father. My stomach lurched. Why was he here? I proceeded to reception, and there he stood. My father. He appeared terrible, aged, frail, dark circles beneath his eyes, and for the first instance, genuinely apprehensive. I didn't speak. I simply crossed my arms and waited. He cleared his throat. James, I simply need to converse. I stared. He seemed so distinct from the man who'd screamed in my driveway months prior about ingratitude. This wasn't fury. This was hopelessness. Still, I wouldn't relent. Be brief, I stated. Then he uttered something unimaginable. Your mother abandoned me. I froze. Of all possibilities, this was unanticipated. Apparently, after my severance, everything collapsed. Without my financial support, they finally faced reality. Stress fractured them. They blamed each other. My mother, ever the manipulator, chose to leech from another rather than remain with my father. So she departed. And now my father, who'd supported every lie, every scheme, every exploitation, stood before me, solitary, appearing utterly defeated. And you know what? I felt emptiness. No sympathy, no fury, simply nothing. I shrugged. Not my concern. His expression collapsed. James, please, I interrupted. Number. You both selected your paths. Endure them. Then I turned and re-entered. And suddenly, it was conclusively finished. Final reflection. I never heard from my father again. My mother, from what I gather, relocated with some distant relation and likely repeats her patterns. But I'm indifferent. If you enjoyed this story and felt the emotions behind it, don't forget to give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more real-life experiences and heartfelt stories. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more content like this to you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.